This podcast is brought to you by Voice and Vision, bringing help, hope, and healing to individuals, families, and communities affected by mental illness, addictions, and disabilities in southeastern Pennsylvania. Financial support for this podcast is provided by a Veterans Trust Fund grant from the Pennsylvania Department of Military and Veterans Affairs.
Welcome to Untold Valor, a podcast with a unique focus on veterans, featuring stories of courage, recovery, perseverance, and strength. Listen to hear veterans share their perspectives on what it's like to battle mental health challenges, combat addictions, and overcome other adversities unique to those who have served.
Welcome to another edition of Untold Valor. Thanks for tuning into the podcast as we talk with different folks through different walks of life, sharing their stories as it relates to the military and life after the military and issues that can arise. And we've got a special guest once again this week. We're always happy to have various different folks come on and talk to us from walks of life. And of course, Reverend Ben is here as my co-host as always. But we also have Kyle Hanlan with us. And Kyle's got quite the resume as well. We're going to get into Kyle's story here in just a second. Right now, he is the vice president of LLMC Partners, where he provides advisory services to companies and organizations to guide them on leadership and organizational culture. And he's got a ton of other things in there. So we're going to get into his story here in just a second, but just a quick rundown on Kyle. First of all, Reverend Ben, welcome in. How are you this week?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
Doing good. Always glad to have you here to share your side of things as well. And looking forward to talking with Kyle and getting into his story. So let's jump in and get going. Kyle, thanks for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
It's really an honor.
Absolutely. No, we always appreciate folks' time to stop by and share their stories with others. So let's just start with our basic thing we typically do, Kyle. Tell us about your time, about your service. You served in the military. You were in the Army. So tell us a little bit about you and your backstory.
Of course. I've always say that I've had the most nonlinear career path there was. I don't say that as a flex by any means. Just when I talk to people, it's the quickest reaction I get is, "Do you have professional ADD?" And I think I do. I served 6 years active, 2 years guard, and then I was actually a civilian working for the Navy. So I either upgraded or downgraded, depending on your point of view, going from the Army to the Navy. I started off as an avionics technician. I was a 15 Foxtrot. I worked on Black Hawks and Chinooks, working on electrical systems. And then after a series of unfortunate events, we lost our entire supply department the moment we got to Iraq within the first month.
Oh, wow.
And then they said, "Hey, we need 3 volunteers." I said, 3 volunteers for what, Sergeant? Okay, now we need 2 volunteers. So that's how I got into supply chain management as a 92 Yankee, doing on-the-job training for the Army. Then a very rare occurrence, our unit got disbanded after we got back. So then they didn't know what to do with me. So they threw me over. I became a 27 Delta, which is a paralegal. So I went from avionics to supply chain management to the law, which just logically flows naturally, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that makes total sense linearly.
Yeah, of course. Which the reason why I bring this up is because it really puts the backdrop to where my life went and what gives context to the story. Mm-hmm. And then I got offered a very great deal with the Pennsylvania National Guard. I got a 2-year contract with 2-year non-deployable status. And I was planning on getting out to go to college anyways. So why, I was going to use my GI Bill to the hilt. Why not use one of the things that I was learning and keeping in touch with, which is what I try to tell all veterans that's about to get out, is try to learn from the mistakes of other people. Don't try to learn the hard way yourself. Yeah. And so I was trying to learn and study what are some of the hardships that people were dealing with when they were getting out before I got out. And one of the, people were looking at where are they going to live? What are they going to do for work? How are they going to get an income? That's the primary focus of people when they were getting out.
That transition period is what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah. Absolutely. That transition period. And I was like, well, what about healthcare? Health insurance. What about those little nuances that trip everybody up? What about those social expectations? What about the friends that you had before you went into the military, and now that you're coming out, do you still have that same connection,
Mm-hmm.
or are you hoping that everything stayed the same, like time stopped? And
Right.
so I started looking at that, and I said, okay, well, I'm going to join the Guard coming out so that I would at least have a nice transition period. I ended up using my GI Bill really far more than what it was intended, because at the time, the post 9/11 GI Bill, the Chapter 33 wasn't really closely monitored. So I did 3 degrees in 34 months straight. I did an
Wow.
associate's, a bachelor's, and a master's in 34 months, because why have a social life?
Well, yeah, right out the window. Right out the window.
Well, the way I looked at it is, well, the GI Bill was going to pay for $90,000. Why not? That's
Yeah.
a student loans that I didn't need.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely just jumping in and taking advantage of the situation. Why not? Exactly. I see you have completed 7 degrees all told.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And I've just enrolled into an 8th.
Wow.
Because I must be a glutton for punishment. But honestly, it's really because I'm a firm believer that 4 people stand around an elephant. Each person's going to have a different perspective of what that elephant looks like. And so I really found my calling in the military about serving others, about serving the general community. And I've always believed, there's so many issues going on. I just never said, oh, I'm just going to sit back and complain about those issues. To me, I don't really feel me personally, I'm not saying this about anybody else, but for me personally, I've never really felt comfortable or justifiable in how I can complain without trying to do something about that.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to look at different ways of how I can better serve my community, whether that's through whether that's through a systems perspective of engineering management, whether that's through a policy at a federal or state level with my doctorate in public policy and administration, or whether that's looking at individual behaviors in the veteran community with IO Psych, or just finding veterans with GIS. Just geographical information systems, just trying to understand different perspectives for this. And this really led me to, again, after I was done the first few degrees, I then started working for the NAVSUP, the Naval Supply Systems Command, in Northeast Philadelphia. And I was working in foreign military sales, where I was the logistical liaison between the U.S. Navy and 19 different countries, where I was literally working not just with the U.S. Navy, but working with foreign militaries and understanding. I started seeing commonalities, not just in the U.S. military, but all militaries.
So what do you mean commonalities in what arena, Kyle?
In terms of the culture.
Okay.
And thank you for pointing that out, because that's really one of the biggest hiccups that we as veterans, we have a misalignment. There's the misalignment of expectations. There seems to be this understanding that just because we're recruited from the civilian world, that when we go back to that society, it's the same society that we knew and were used to.
Okay.
But
yeah, I got you. So the transition period of the cultural shift, right?
It really is a cultural shift.
Yeah.
The DoD spends an average $10 billion with a B every year on indoctrination programs, whether it's for recruitment. And indoctrination, it has a stigma to it. It's not. It's just it means it's a change in culture. It doesn't mean anything bad.
It's a harsh word, for sure.
It really is a harsh word, and it doesn't mean that by any means. It just means it's a shift in culture. Because how do you get people from all walks of life to follow and align with the same core values and behaviors, or as I call the unspoken acceptable norms, values, and beliefs of an organization? But
makes sense.
We spend on average $10 billion a year. But then when people transition out, the DoD spends $40 million with an M on transition services for people leaving. But then the VA, the Department of Veteran Affairs, spends over $300 million every single year on transition services or social services for veterans, trying to reintegrate them back into society.
It's still a pretty big disparity in numbers.
It really is. And that's just the financial impact to the general public. 68% of veterans After leaving the military, 68 seek some sort of social reintegration services at the VA within the first 3 months of getting out. 92%, that number jumps up to 92% if you stretch that out to a year. 92% of veterans seek some sort of help trying to find their place in life through the VA within the first year. That there is a major issue going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Kyle, I do agree with you. There are a lot of veterans who are not aware of the resources that are available to them. In my situation, when I got out, I didn't even know I could have benefits until somebody told me. So it's very important that the veterans know that the benefits are there.
Yeah, they're seeking them, it sounds
Absolutely.
like, Kyle, but they're just sometimes there's a connectivity issue, maybe. Is that what we're looking at, possibly?
Possibly, as a scholar myself, or a scholar practitioner, it's a more accurate description. I try to not say, "Oh, this is definitely the cause," but I would say that's absolutely a probable influence to the outcome. Absolutely, which I struggled myself, and part of the thing is that I didn't realize until after years, almost a decade afterwards. I didn't even realize that I had PTSD until about 10 years after I got out. Because I'm like, no. There's other things going on. Other people have things far more worse than I do. There was no one single event, but I didn't realize just how impacted I was by the cultural disparity of that transition.
So, like a loss of identity is that
There's
part of that?
A major. It's a loss of place. It's a loss of central identity and a loss of placement within society.
It's a shock, too. It's a cultural shock to be reintroduced to civilian society when there's no system set up for that.
Yes.
It's a shock to the veteran.
Yes. It's a culture shock. And I went through that firsthand without understanding that, which is why, they always say that psychologists become psychologists, the old joke. And again, I mean this as a joke, but the old joke is that psychologists become psychologists because they have some personal issue that they're trying to work through. I studied veteran reintegration because I struggled so much with my reintegration.
Yeah.
Finding a job, finding sustainable work, the whole 9 yards. The TAP program, the Transition Assistance Program, is a fantastic program if you're trying to help with career transition. But the problem is that veterans do not understand. And I know the only generalization is you can't make generalizations, but I'm making a generalization here. Generally speaking, veterans have a hard time understanding that it's a different culture that they're returning to. It's not the same thing that they're used to, that their placement in society, that the symbols that we're used to, that we interact with on a daily basis, our uniform, our badges, our unit patches represent where we belong. Even our rank structure helps us understand where we fit into society, and then we don't have that when we get out. And even the expectation of civilians on us. I had one job where my boss said, hired a bunch of veterans, and this was with the federal government, mind you. This wasn't a private company. The federal government is like, I hired a bunch of veterans because you guys know how to take orders. I don't understand why there's any issue. And that's the assumption, is that there's a massive disconnect between military and the civilian sector.
And I think, that would probably apply to the job too, right? In some cases, people do think let me hire somebody from the military, ex-military, because they do have that, focus, I suppose, maybe, right? But then depending on the type of job or work that it is, that may not translate.
And the reason why it doesn't translate is because the underlying culture is missing. A E3, or I should say, in the Army, it will be a private. A junior enlisted is trusting their more senior NCOs, not because an order is given, but because that junior enlisted knows that that order would not be given arbitrarily without trying to ensure the safety of that junior enlisted.
Yeah, and the corporate world definitely, especially recently, has there's a lot of openness to it, right? In a lot of ways, so you could easily see where you could get lost and not have that track to follow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, so this is one of the reasons why I went back and kind of worked through my own issues of how much problems that are, I'm trying to, through helping others, I'm trying to help myself, which is something that veterans do almost naturally, is we try to help each other to help ourselves.
Yeah.
We reach out and we try to be that band of brothers and sisters to ensure that we're a support system. And when I did my research, I was looking at what is the cultural transition, not the career transition, but what are those social expectations on the veterans part and of the civilian side part of how do you calibrate back to the civilian world?
Well, and if for a second, think about the cultural shift too, depending on when and where you served. Okay. Because think about how we've just seen it in society from a cultural shift from whether you served in Vietnam or whether you served in Iraq, right? There's
Absolutely.
totally different. And the mindsets of the public at home obviously shifted greatly in that 40-year, 50-year period too.
Absolutely. But I would say that there's still a lot of commonality. That
True, yeah.
Because they say that 1%, less than 1% are currently serving, and the VA doesn't even know how many veterans are currently living in the United States, which is an issue all itself.
Yeah.
But the biggest estimates I've seen are just under 7% of the total population have served in the military, which means there's a massive disparity that there's no Rosetta Stone for a large 93% of the population to really understand what cultural differences the veterans have. And vice versa.
And maybe that's some of the struggle. So, obviously what we do here on the podcast in the particular mission of this and from Voice and Vision and Compure Core is to really help veterans transition, figure out where they can get help if they need help, just coming up with the fact that it's okay to ask for help, right? I mean, there's whatever stigma you want to go with there. Often there's that, be tough, suck it up, whatever kind of thing, right? So you don't need help or don't ask for help or whatever. And so that's a lot of the mission on the podcast here. So with that kind of in mind, and you're talking about calibrating or recalibrating the civilian life, anything that you found that was helpful that you could share with listeners who may be in a similar situation, who feel a little lost or feel a little struggling with that kind of, aptitude?
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought up the stigma of mental health, because if your leg was broken, you would go to the hospital. Well, depending on, I know some construction workers that will probably just duct tape that up and try to finish
or
off
at least
their
an
day.
emergency clinic down the street, right? Something, right?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. But just because it's a behavioral issue or a psychological issue doesn't mean it's not still an issue that needs to be addressed. It shouldn't be any different. Now, with that, whether it's military, law enforcement, emergency services, firefighters, there's still that. Even within the ranks, if you're seeking help, then others in that industry will actually start shunning you. So there's a very real professional impact for seeking help. This is one of the reasons why, as much as I say, go seek help, go seek help, go seek help. Oh, and then when you're done seeking help, go seek more help. I understand the realism of it. For a lot of people, they just are afraid of the stigma of how it's going to impact them and their careers. So what I always say is reach out to your brother and sister, reach out to another veteran that can help that. I live in a community where in Chester County, where there's a lot of veterans, and we will just at least once a month, we just get together around a bonfire and just start just talking about our lives. So it doesn't have to be such a great intervention. Just letting each other know that you're there, it is a great start for that.
Yeah, Ben, that's something that's obviously right there with your core as well, because that's one of the things that you've shared on the podcast before that was helpful for you and that you do with others is just being there, just being a buddy, just being somebody who's had similar experiences.
Absolutely. Another thing too is what I have found is that when we are veterans come home and we are stricken with certain ailments and mental health issues, when we find recovery, I have found the only way to really keep it is to give it away. So when Kyle says to reach out to another veteran, that is absolutely correct. That's the only way we can keep it is to share it with somebody else who's still struggling.
Paying it forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We were brother and sister in arms downrange. Why is that not still the same here?
Very true.
Right.
Yeah.
one of the biggest things for the reintegration is, first and foremost, understanding that it's a different culture that we're transitioning into. Even if you've been out of the service for 5 or 10 years, I know, like I said, for me, it was still a struggle for almost a decade understanding, because I just didn't even, it was kind of, I just didn't even understand that there was a problem. So just even admitting that there was a problem to go seek help was a struggle in itself, because no. I grew up here. I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania. I know exactly where it is, because even throughout my time in the military, I'm like, no matter where it is, when I get out, whatever my career takes, I'm going to go back to a place where there's a Wawa, because I know that's where home is.
That's right. I need a tasty cake, man.
I need a taste cake.
Kyle, you're absolutely right. But one thing we also have to consider, what I found is that the veteran goes into the military, he leaves the society. He goes into the military and he gets a whole different culture he's struck with. But then coming home, sometimes it's not the same society we left.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, it definitely changes, right?
It really does.
Yeah.
And that's that was really where the focal point of my research was. Just like when you come home from a deployment, your family often changes. As much as we hope time stops, because time feels like it stops for us while we're downrange. But your spouse, your kids, they develop coping mechanisms to move on their daily lives that may not always include us. It's not that they don't miss us, it's just they have their own way of life, just like society keeps going without us as well. And that is a very hard truth to understand, which is why in building that support structure around for veterans is within our community is so critical. If you don't know where to find other veterans, yes, there's always the VSOs, the Veteran Service Organizations, the VFW, American Legion, Purple Heart, DAV. There's a bunch of different places there, but then there's also other areas such as Chester County and Delaware County and Montgomery County all have outreach programs that are veteran affairs advisory councils that you can connect with other veterans. There's often many different events going on almost on a quarterly basis where you can connect with other veterans. We also have this way of self-identifying with all the flags outside of our houses.
True.
Just reach out. Or what about the people we served with? Just because they're not in our local area doesn't mean we don't have to connect. There is a lot of, I still talk to a bunch of my friends. Going back to AIT, Advanced Individual Training, it's where you learn your MOS. I still talk to people from 20 years ago.
There you go.
Just reaching out and saying, hey, how are you doing? How is your life? How's your kids? How's your husband? What's going on in your life? It is amazing how much help we can give each other just by letting each other know that we're there.
That's a great place to, I think, wrap up the podcast this week as well. So some good resources, some places that Kyle shared. We'll put those up on the show notes as well. And I was going to ask, I always do this at the end of the podcast, what's kind of a message that you have for others out there? Clearly this entire show has been filled with that, but any kind of specific thing you'd like to hone in on as we depart this week?
Yes, and I really apologize for the shameless plug. I really don't mean it to be this way, but I really designed my dissertation to be more of a self-help guide for other veterans. So it's the reacculturation of veterans post-transition assistance program. You could just Google my name, KYLE, Hotel Alpha November, Lima Alpha November. You could just Google that and you'll find a dissertation, and it has all the helpful steps on the transition. But most importantly, for all the veterans out there, text or call, grab your phone right now and reach out to one of your battle buddies. It could save a life.
That's fantastic. Kyle, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Great story, tons of information. So we certainly really appreciate having you here. Ben, thanks for being here as well. I know we're up against the clock on the show, but again, I always want to thank folks for when they stop by, and we'll put lots of links up for folks to check out afterwards. If you need some help, we'll have all that stuff at the end of the podcast, as well as ways to subscribe to the show to catch future episodes and support others as well. Kyle, thanks again.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Reverend Ben, thanks for hanging out, my friend, as always. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next time.
Likewise.
And we'll catch you next time here on the podcast. This has been Untold Valor. You've been listening to Untold Valor by Voice and Vision. We hope you found the information and resources discussed today helpful. As always, thank you for listening and for your support. Remember to stay connected with us through our various social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Don't forget to visit the website, voiceandvisioninc.org. That's voiceandvisioninc.org, where you can sign up for our blog and find free resources and information on upcoming events, webinars, workshops, and get support. You can also access our free help and hope guide for individuals and families struggling with substance use and addiction. If someone you know is struggling, please reach out for help because you and your life matter. Remember, the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available to you at any time by dialing 988. We are all ambassadors of hope and recovery, and if you want to share your story, please contact us. Compeer Corps is also looking for veteran mentor volunteers and veteran participants. To find out more information about Compeer Corps, please call 610-541-0790. That's 610-541-0790. You can find all the links and contact information for the resources mentioned on today's episode by checking the description and the show notes section of your app. Thank you again for tuning in and for your support. Until next time, this has been Untold Valor.